Delegates Lounge. Pull up a chair. I'm Alex Tarquinio, a journalist based at the United Nations here in New York City, and your MC for this podcast, featuring some of the most influential minds in the world today. Settle in for some riveting tete-a-tete, available wherever you listen to podcasts. Welcome back. Today represents a new beginning. This is the first episode of the Delegates Lounge, published simultaneously to our new YouTube channel. In the little while since we brought you the Midsummer Special, we've been busy backfilling the channel with our previous episodes. For our regular listeners, we'll continue to publish to Apple Podcasts and Spotify, but YouTube lets you watch videos and subtitles translated into a variety of languages, from Arabic to Ukrainian. Search for the Delegates Lounge on YouTube and be sure to hit the subscribe button. In today's episode, we bring you our conversation with the prominent Ukrainian journalist Natalia Gumenyuk. I was fortunate to meet Natalia at a small gathering in her honor at the Ukrainian Institute of America, a cultural center here in New York that sits across the street from the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Natalia was in town for a few days recently, arriving from London, where she gave opening remarks at the world premiere of The Reckoning, a limited-run documentary play that ran at the Arcola Theater in June. She is a co-founder of both The Reckoning Project, which gathers testimonies from survivors in the Russian-occupied territories of Ukraine, and the Public Interest Journalism Lab, a Kyiv-based NGO focused on an interdisciplinary approach to journalism. Natalia is an independent journalist herself, specializing in foreign affairs and conflict reporting. She's a regular contributor to international publications like The Atlantic, Foreign Affairs, and The Guardian. Our conversation touches on her recent article for The Atlantic about drone warfare, so we'll include a gift link to that in the show notes. We also talked about prisoner swaps, the forced relocation of Ukrainian children, Ukraine's Operation Spiderweb, the highly successful covert drone attack deep inside Russia, and Victoria Roshina, the Ukrainian journalist who died in Russian detention. Natalia had worked with her and described Victoria's last reporting trip to the occupied territories before her capture. Natalia says Victoria weighed around 35 kilos after her time in Russian captivity. For our American listeners, that's less than 80 pounds. While recording our conversation in Manhattan, we were interrupted by an air raid alert from Kyiv on Natalia's phone. Proof, as if any were needed, that Ukrainians can leave the war zone, but the war doesn't entirely leave them. Here's our conversation. Natalia Gumenyuk, thank you for joining us in the Delegates Lounge.
It's my pleasure.
I was fortunate enough to meet you at the Ukrainian Institute the other day and hear a little bit of your story. So before 2014 and the war came to Ukraine, you wanted to be a war correspondent, and you were a war correspondent. Tell us a little bit about that.
So when I went to the university in 2000, it was still kind of Ukraine was post-authoritarian country. But there was a very clear idea that the journalism should be independent. So I was always interested in the foreign news. So I, started to work as a foreign news correspondent. And particularly prior to the 2014, to the Russian invasion, I became very interested in the Middle East and the Arab Spring, because I was always interested in the idea of people standing up for justice, and spent a couple of years traveling around the Middle East in particular, Egypt, Iraq, Tunisia, all other countries, looking at how my generation was like trying to change something in their countries. But in 2013, what we called the Revolution of Dignity started, the Maidan Revolution, which was mainly the protest against police brutality and injustice. So I returned home. We co-founded an independent TV station called Hromadske, which was a grassroots public broadcaster. When there is no yet legislation, there is no kind of state structure, but we'll do the media which serves the public. And when Russia occupied Crimea, I probably was one of the few fit to go undercover to Crimea, go to the eastern Ukraine, and becoming this kind of conflict reporter in my own country. By the way, my experience as a foreign correspondent was extremely helpful, particularly because it's very hard to pass to the foreign audience, to tell the story about suffering far away so they care. What I always believe and try to tell the story, both to the Ukrainians and now when I'm, for instance, writing for the Americans. Actually, suffering is very universal, and we often try to portray the conflicts, in this very geopolitical way. Russian speakers, Ukrainian speakers, pro-European, pro-Russian, and in the Middle East, like religious and secular, Islamist and liberals, which is not the case. People in the Middle East, a lot of them were fighting against police brutality, police impunity, and corruption. And I actually wanted to pass this message that all these fights are more, relatable. In 2014, because the war was taking place somewhere in Crimea, in the eastern Ukraine. So after some time, if you live in the capital, you can kind of pretend it's not about you. And you can very easily forget, about the people in the Russian occupation at that time. So for me, I found this experience of telling the faraway wars to be very helpful, first, to cut through to the audiences back home. Because after a couple of years, at first people are excited, there is anxiety, they want to, there is a war in Ukraine, there are Russian soldiers in Crimea. But after a year, people get used to these stories, the suffering is still there, but it's harder to be in the news. When it's the third year of the full-fledged Russian war against Ukraine. And yes, we, trying also again to tell this story, but now for the global audience. And I really try to do it more relatable.
What we often hear is there's the Russian speakers and the Ukrainian speakers. There's the people in the East. How do you break down those dichotomies and tell people it's not as simplistic as that?
So I was telling a lot of story about the Ukrainian, like how diverse is Ukraine in particular. So the first stories after full-scale invasion, I would be in bed with the Jewish community, with Ukrainian Muslim community, with people of various backgrounds and also social political backgrounds. But it's more or less the mere existence of Ukraine for the Russian authoritarian regime. It's irritation because it shows that in our part of the world there could be the functioning democracy. That the very similar people, like in Russia, like in Belarus, like in Moldova, can have democratic government, can elect their own authorities, and can choose the way they live. For the last 35 years, Ukraine, with different successes, was still democracy. Problematic sometimes better, sometimes worse, but you have civil society, you have, press. Some press is bad, some is better, some is, high quality, poor quality, some is politically controlled. But we have at least a tradition that it's normal to fight for freedoms. It's normal to think, to have your opinion. And when I'm now reporting about the Russian occupation in the newly occupied territories after 2022, it's very interesting how one of the members of the family of the survivors who survived the Russian detention and tortures told me that in currently occupied territories, Ukrainian territories by Russia, it's enough to have own opinion to be suspicious and to be detained. And this is a difference. So it's still a dichotomy, but it's a different dichotomy. I just recently was interviewed by the Japanese television. They again asked the question about language. And I would say what language people in Taiwan speak? And when I was in touch with Singaporean journalists and Korean journalists and the others, they would say the fact you speak Chinese in Singapore, they also speak Chinese. They're a different country and they have a different idea about China than Taiwanese. It doesn't mean you support what Beijing does. And I do think that's what Russia is in our part of the world, the Russian language. And of course, it was the language of empire. It was the language of the big country. And it was a professional language because universities were in Russian. The technical jobs, like if you want to be considered civilized, you need to know this language. Otherwise, you would be considered like a village person,
So even in Kyiv or Lviv, where they might speak Ukrainian at home or with their friends, they would still speak Russian at the university and at work.
You were supposed to kind of speak Russian to be perceived as a cultural and educated person. So you learn, and that's make it like that people speak two languages. Of course, now the political culture changed. You don't have this pressure for 30 years. But I think even in the 90s, it was still kind of preserved that, the Russian is the language of the educated.
So there was a language caste system in essence. Even in the 90s, was it sometime in the aughts that it started to change? Or was it really the Maidan revolution? Because now I think in some parts, with some Ukrainians, they actually look askance if you speak Russian.
No, you still, it depends. In my generation, we used to speak both. So for instance, my sister is 5 years older than me. And I went to the school in 1991. That was the year when Ukraine regained its independence. So I went to the school, which was Ukrainian speaking. She went to the school 5 years earlier than me. And at that time in our town near Kyiv, there was no Ukrainian in her particular school. So, she developed these habits, which shows that even like a personal education, the same family, people can speak two different languages at home. And people usually in journalism are more into language. So, my Ukrainian is perfect. She studied law. And in this field, it was always Russian dominating. So,
So the laws were written in Russian.
Traditionally, those people who studied technical science, all these kind of things. What happened today, little by little, the Ukrainian became the norm, even in Crimea, even in the Eastern Ukraine, because it's like state language. But I think that because we are perfectly a bilingual country, Russia is using the language as a pretext. For a lot of people, especially in the Eastern Ukraine, close to the Russian border, it's indeed a political stance saying no, I'll speak Ukrainian outside of home just to make this political point, which is also important that Ukrainian really became kind of a political language. So, for instance, the minorities, Crimean Tatars, Jewish, Polish, or wherever, Armenian, Georgians, Roma, because, the Russian was still this kind of lingua franca. And now they all think no, we also will speak Ukrainian just to show our loyalty for this state, for this country.
So the Tatars or
now speaking, Ukrainian in their public life. They may speak still Russian at home, but they would like to make this point. So this is indeed a fight about different political system, authoritarian, democratic, but it's not bounded that much around ethnicity.
Now, that's a very interesting thing, because the Ukrainian military forces are obviously very inventive. And one, I think, potential advantage they have here is that they can understand both the mindset of the Russian war fighting and special ops from the Soviet past, but also because they are in that long period of application in NATO, they understand NATO. So they can see similarities and differences between those two.
Yes. And what I also found interesting being, embedded in one of the tactical operations centers with one of the brigades, intercepts. Intercepts, you can do it a lot. People speak mobile phones, something. And they really work hard on intercepting the Russian stalking behind the line. By the way, I should also say, when I was speaking in spring, quite a few different units reconfirmed that what they intercepted in the Russians speaking, they were all telling we need to keep little because there is Trump in there. So, he's on our side and it's a bit, we'll soon win it, which was also paradoxically, that's what Russians say in their intercepts. I'm not telling anything. I'm just retelling. I'm speaking about this spring. So they were kind of reinforced that it's just a bit. Soon, the Trump will get us the best deal possible for the Russians. But in any case, how do soldiers speak? Slang. It's not a normal language. If you're even a best translator, to know it as a native person. But it was paradoxical. I understood that half of the words actually slang. So a normal translator would never know. And it's a bit of the benefit of the Ukrainians to understand also the Russian slang.
But they monitor each other on Telegram, or so I hear.
The Russians won't get the Ukrainian slang.
They don't know Ukrainian.
They don't know Ukrainian.
Well, the other thing that's relatively new, because you are a young country, is the tradition of independent journalism, because it is only a little more than 30 years since you were independent of the Soviet Union. Have you noticed a change from when you were first a journalism student? Has the real sense of independent journalism as an important aspect that just everyday Ukrainians would see it as being important? Or was it really Maidan that changed that?
The independent journalism mattered a lot, and there is a particular trauma in our country. In 2001, a famous Ukrainian journalist, Georgy Gangadze, one of the founders of the first online publication, Ukrainska Pravda, was killed. Later, there was an investigation. He was kidnapped, and he was killed on the command of the Minister of Interior. There is still not a clear finding whether the former president Leonid Kuchma was behind that. But it was the case which also led later to protest and was a part of the anti-authoritarian protests in Ukraine in early 2000s, exactly in the time when I was in the university. So there is something in Ukrainian kind of journalistic DNA that you don't trust authorities. It's overcritical to the government. It was like that. It is like that by default. If you want to be a good journalist in Ukraine, you are supposed to criticize the government. That's how we are. That's how we were taught. Of course, there was these bigger oligarchic-owned channels, and indeed they were controlled by our oligarchs, by the government in different times. But there was, by the way, what is interesting, also the competition between the oligarchs owning the political kind of channels. But since 2014, this system is kind of broken. We do have a public broadcaster. Also, the role of these private companies is smaller. And we have a very strong, environment of the independent media. Of course, the money are the problem. So a lot of Ukrainian independent media were supported by international donors. But by 2022, we have the thousands of independent Ukrainian media. And what is also important, that despite the full-scale invasion, we preserve this pluralism. But interesting enough that for the whole 3 years, we do have leaks, we do have scandals, we do have political investigations into the military security, very sensitive ones, but they are discussed. There are cases when, the general would be fired because of the journalistic story. So it's both, I'm not saying that the Ukrainian army is perfect, but for me, these kind of unfortunate cases of investigation into the Ukrainian security forces during the war, even if sometimes it actually shows not about the problem about the, what's happening with the security service, because I don't believe they're perfect ever. But still, you do that in the country at war. And I do think it's extremely important. Even sometimes I would say that we can be overcritical, but I do think it's the way how we preserve our kind of sanity as a professionals.
The more things change, the more they stay the same, because some of what you're describing could be here or almost anywhere with the free press. Ukrainians are very outspoken, right?
in Ukraine, prior to the full-scale invasion, actually journalists almost fight with the president. I'm literally saying they would yell at president. It became a bit less heated during the first year of the full-scale invasion, but I think still in the press conferences, the Ukrainian journalists would still, tell the long story about what's wrong with the way you run the country.
Zelensky's performance in the Oval Office, was that viewed well? Did that improve his popularity ratings?
Yeah, it definitely improved his popularity ratings. I think the idea that he said that, we don't play cards, we're here not about playing cards, I think that was a major thing, to nail it down, that it's serious about human life. It's not a joke, and it's quite unfortunate, the trust to the U.S., which is diminishing.
His popularity must be higher recently with the Operation Spiderweb, or does that reflect on the president? I mean, in the United States, if there's a hugely successful operation, there usually is a reflection of the presidential polls.
Yes, but to be honest, I'm very cautious about the polls. But yes, of course.
I mean, obviously, they're the same civilians that are under, if possible, even more rank fire. But is that still viewed positively?
So I think it's very important to say that there is no kind of reason for escalation. The idea about the escalation is the way that Russia wants to save the face, because it's a very practical thing for Ukraine. this operation served two goals. You destroy some of the Russian equipment, which would retaliate, but also you force Russia to probably be more concerned about the targets inside of Russia, so they would have less resources and capabilities to fight against Ukraine. So it serves two ways to constrain Russians. But again, like we think about that as something very, very practical.
Is there a little bit of an audience of one for this, that they, the Russians and obviously the Ukrainian administration are trying to reach Donald Trump?
The Ukrainian administration is definitely trying to reach out to Trump. The U.S. is an important player. The tragic part in this war is that the whole world, not just Ukraine, found itself being dependent on the American air defense, because it's just the Patriot missile system which are capable to stop the Russian ballistic missiles. All the rest is doable. That is a bit like on the mercy of Donald Trump. So overall, Ukraine definitely doesn't want to have the bad relations with the United States. You really don't want to throw the United States into the Russian hands.
Tell us a little bit about the Public Interest Journalism Lab. Is this one of the reasons that you founded that, or you co-founded it?
So we created this organization, Public Interest Journalism Lab, more or less trying to explore how you speak to the audiences which do not care about human rights and sensitive issues, and how do you reach to the people who distrust you with also kind of critical message. Because I was also reporting a lot from the US that polarization creates the best ground for conspiratorial thinking, for distrust, for erosion of democracy. And it just happened the day we founded, COVID started. At that time, we were all investigating the ways you report about the vaccination so people trust the vaccines. And it's very interesting finding, instead of mocking the people, you really need to answer their real concerns. That was a huge insight, because then when the full-scale invasion, started, I'm always saying we need to answer the questions of the audience. We really need to figure out what are those vulnerabilities. And by default, to find the ways to tell the sensitive story in the way that people would trust us. What we learned, the number one thing from the Russian propaganda, because beyond that they lie bluntly, they, dehumanize Ukrainians. What they do, they try to look into the vulnerabilities in our own society, exploit them, and then bring all conspiracies. And then if you kind of persuade people to believe in conspiracies, then they can feed other conspiracies into them about the Russia, about the war, about something.
So one of your objectives at the lab is to elevate truthful journalism above disinformation and all that we see on the social media. Well, it's obviously very dangerous to do journalism now in Ukraine, particularly in the occupied territories or near the front lines. And I don't know if this falls more within your Public Journalism Lab hat or the Reckoning Project, but I do know that you said there are 35 journalists actually being held by Russia now that you know of, right? And you also knew Victoria Roshnia, or you were her editor. And for listeners, I'm sure our listeners are familiar with this terrible case, but when her body was returned finally from Russia, there were signs of torture and some of her organs had been removed. So you knew her personally and had worked with her, is that right?
This is a very sad story of a very courageous Ukrainian journalist, Victoria Roshina, who worked at Hromadske for quite some years, a very determined young female investigative reporter, very much a bit too much passionate about, the duty to serve her public. So she risked her life, literally, to go to report the life under the occupation. She disappeared at some time. It was summer 2023. And then we figure out that she was detained incommunicado. What we learned later, she is a journalist, she was on the assignment. She was, after some time, moved to Russian territory. She was tortured. She was treated inhumanly. She had a very poor health conditions, she was probably 35 kilos because of some, healthcare issues. And in autumn 2024, 2004, her father received the note from the Russian Defense Ministry that she's dead. Then it took some time to retrieve her body back to Ukraine. It was confirmed that it was her. The family is still a bit in denial. But what is for me striking in that regard, of course, the Russians are in charge and they're responsible for what happened, because what we know that she was in poor health conditions already since December 2023. That's what people who were with her at the same kind of cells told. So by September 2024, let's say like 10 months, at any given moment, they could let her go. If there is this kind of girl, like 27, which is like 35 kilos, you either give some medical support, let her go. And for me, as her former editor, as a colleague, what is the most frightening is our inability to do something about that. Because compared to quite a lot of local reporters whose names we don't know, even in Ukraine, because it's about small towns, some local papers, it was like quite a prominent case. We all knew her. She's in the capital. She writes for the major independent media. We are well connected. We speak for the Committee to Protect Journalism. She got an award for the International Media Women Foundation. I was speaking at every single, not just myself, events like UNESCO Press Freedom Day. You working for, you working and covering the UN a lot. A year ago, we were at the panel, in particularly at the UNESCO Press Freedom Day in Chile, where we did the panel and we screened the documentary you watched. And we brought those journalists who experienced occupation to that panel. So all the people who kind of in charge of the press freedoms in the world were there. She was still alive at that point. So we were there making the point, like, this is a documentary about what's happening to the Ukrainian journalists in the occupation. Here are the journalists who survived occupation. Here is our colleague. She's somewhere in Russia. She's what we can do about that. And then 4 months after, we received this note about her death. So for me, it's more about this frustration, that now, of course, we can establish the fellowship of her name, as it often happens in case of the deceased journalist. But that's why I want to bring to attention that there are these other 35. We haven't saved Victoria. Can we save others, at least some of them? Can we be more bold? I know it's difficult. I know it depends on Russia. But I do think if these institutions exist, if these committees exist, we still need to kind of give a try. I don't blame anybody. I do understand. I talk to a lot of leaders of these institutions, but I just find how kind of they feel powerless. I just don't want us to give up.
Well, advocacy is difficult. Although the Committee to Protect Journalists, they can really only raise awareness. It's in fact the heads of state and government that have to put pressure on for this. The advocacy group kind of comes to a level and then their influence stops. That brings us to what you're doing with the Reckoning Project as a co-founder. First, can we talk a little bit about what the Reckoning Project does that's different from journalism? You are, in fact, involved in the documentation of potential war crimes and other incidents for the future that may, in fact, be used in legal proceedings as well as journalism. Is that right?
Absolutely. So we've been reporting the Russian invasion before 2022 of a different scale still. And as soon as the full-scale invasion started, it was very first hours, even not days, when we talked to colleague Peter Pomerantsev, the quite a known researcher on propaganda, British journalist of the Ukrainian region who lives here in the US. Peter kind of met at Yale University, Janine DiGiovanni, quite also known war correspondent with international background, an American one who covered war in Syria and the others, where the citizen journalists were recording the testimonies of the survivors, of the witnesses of the human rights violation in order to create the archive about the possible litigation. But contrary to that, experience of these various UN projects, Ukraine has a very capable journalistic community. We're doing films, we have the production company. So the Public Interest Journalism Lab right away, together with Janine, Peter, the lawyers, we created a couple of months later the Reckoning Project, which is, in the nutshell, We speak to the direct survivors of the war crimes, not just people who saw something sad, tragic during the war, but those who either were witnesses or survivors themselves. So their testimony can be used for litigation or for all these kind of inquiries, which the United Nations committees will use. But in order to do so, we should be trained in how to speak to the people who lived through traumatic experience. By the way, also with the support of the DART Center.
So the DART Center, I should say, is at Columbia University and deals with trauma journalism.
Yeah, so I
did not know it had a relationship with the DART Center. That's interesting.
So I knew DART Center quite early before, so I called them on board. I'm hiring the journalists who probably do not have this experience of working in such intensity with the survivors, and that would be our endeavor for the next years. Can you please teach us how to care about those people and how to care about ourselves? So we learn from DART about trauma-centric journalism. We learn from the Syrian colleagues and the Jenin's experience, this experience of documentation. And as of now, there is a separate NGO, TRP, run by Jenin Di Giovanni. But we collected over 600 testimonies of the survivors. In all cases, it's a very lengthy conversation done in a very neutral way. So it cannot be dismissed by the judge because there were leading questions. So no leading questions and a lot of details. So for instance, we won't ask the questions, what did Russia do to you? We would ask, what did happen with you at that day? Whom have you seen? How did these people look like? What language did they speak? Did they have an accent? Were they civilians? What kind of guns do you have? Do you remember a call name? So also there would be more details. So it's both journalism in terms of storytelling, but also, way more details to be helpful to find facts for investigators, and also the level of neutrality. So what we collected could be used, for instance, by the UN Commission for Tortures or UN Human Rights Commission, because, maybe sometimes a journalistic interview could be too emotional or would lack some details. We're actually doing the better journalism. More verified, with more evidence, with more nuance and details. And based on these testimonies, the very same testimonies, we create articles, documentaries, so far over 10 documentaries of different lengths. Our first articles were with Vanity Fair, Time Magazine, The Atlantic. Now we're also trying to publish them for the global audiences in Chosun Ilbo in Korea, in Premier Times in Nigeria, in City Press in South Africa, in Infobae in Argentina. And we also believe that what we preserved could be used for culture. We have now play developed by the British Theatre Dash Art Centre, which is, at the stage in London based on the testimonies our team has collected.
So it's really dual use. There's the legal purposes that it may be used for someday, but now it's being used in terms of the culture to get your message out.
And we believe also for the memorials, for the memory. So first of all, there are people who are testifying anonymously. So for instance, if they are from occupation, their families are still there. We use that for analytical work. We are sharing that with the law enforcement. We give this data with the consent of the people, very important.
Now, your researchers, the Reckoning Project, they interview survivors, witnesses, but also survivors directly. The front line has been fairly stable for some time now. Are there more survivors who are walking out, who are somehow escaping, or are they interviewing survivors of areas that have been liberated?
It's becoming more complicated. So it was way easier to collect testimonies in 2022 because there were, let's say, 3 waves of the liberation in the northern Ukraine, in the southern, in the eastern Ukraine near Kharkiv, Izium, and then later in Kherson. So we were able to get into deoccupied territories and see those detention centers, devastated villages, talk to the villages from where people were kidnapped. But it's the story of 2022. And people were very willing to speak about what's going on in the occupation. The longer occupation lasts. There are more atrocities happening, but it's harder for the people to speak because they feel it's more dangerous. If in 2022, 2023, they were thinking I'll tell that story because in a couple of months, the Ukrainian army would, regain access to this territory and my relatives would be freed. Now people thinking, What if they will stay in the occupation for another year? Maybe I don't need to tell that story. And also, Ukraine, contrary to a lot of other countries at war, have the capable law enforcement. So we always try to talk to the people who are not covered by the law enforcement. We try not to duplicate work. So today, the person from the occupation would be probably find it more trustworthy to talk to a journalist and more safe rather than to a Ukrainian prosecutor.
You talked about sort of retooling your skills, but are all the researchers journalists?
In our case, all the researchers are journalists and filmmakers, but documentary filmmakers, which I believe is almost the journalists.
Right.
Among us, is a national journalist who did, who work in human rights, or they were the local reporters, which is also very special because if you're a local reporter, you connect it on a different level. So I do think that we also have a bit of the network of the people with this, connection to their own areas, which makes it also very unique. That's why I really strongly believe in the Reckoning Project, this type of thinking that in the end, it's not like international human rights organization. We're in touch with these people. We know who they are, and there is a network to pass information.
Has the Reckoning Project begun the process of working either with Ukrainian law enforcement or with international aid, maybe a United Nations agency, to find out if what you are gathering is potentially of use?
Indeed. In Ukrainian criminal code, you cannot use somebody else's testimony. The prosecutor should interview the person himself or herself. However, what we did, and it took us some time to develop kind of this capacity, we pass them what we have in kind of format because everything is analyzed, shortened, because you cannot give to prosecutor 3-hour long tape. What we give is like the short abstract. Do we have that? Is it important story? Are we missing something? Should we interview this person and even read what is in this, abstract and what is in this summary and say oh, actually this person have seen something which we are missing. So that's what we're doing. We are
supplementing their work. You're almost pre-interviewing them and perhaps thinking of different questions because you aren't coming from a law enforcement background. You're coming from a journalism background. Perhaps you had a question they hadn't considered.
So we provide that. Of course, now after 3 years, I know that Ukrainian law enforcement, it's the way how the most of the crimes would be investigated. It's not some court in The Hague or something.
Have you looked at The Hague or
how it works?
ICC or have you talked to them to see would this be evidence that would be usable in that context?
So the lawyers of the Reckoning Project strategy is also to use every possible venue. So they are regularly preparing the submissions to most of the UN bodies, various commission of inquiries, torture, human rights, commission on elderly, this type of things. So that's working. There is a particular rapporteur on the Russian war. So we are ready to give some of the testimonies, on demand. In case of ICC, it's interesting. First of all, for ICC, it's very important to preserve their neutrality.
So the Reckoning Project did go to the ICC?
The ICC, for the sake of credibility, doesn't openly speak about how it cooperates with the organizations. It takes a lot from everybody, but they wouldn't admit that. So everybody cooperates with ICC. They take everybody's data, but there is nothing like the cooperation of the ICC with independent organizations. And I should also say a lot of these stories are not really public. The judges actually and the investigators don't want to work with a story which is too public, if you're speaking about the individual story. So there is there is a bit of the tension between the legal work and the journalistic work. So therefore, we are a bit protective about our survivors. Yet if they want to speak, it's their right. If they think it's the only way to do that, if they really want to seek the justice, for some have this courage, some have this strength to speak. They still can fight their case, but we need to warn them. It's our duty to warn them. And some people choose to be public. Sometimes it's really, it's all about the case. So for instance, we want Vladimir Putin to be charged for the deportation of the Ukrainian children. Okay, maybe in that particular investigation, there would be different children. The main is him to be charged. And you do it both ways. Some people are very pivotal for creating awareness, for making the public case. Because without the public case, maybe there won't be investigation. The first case opened by ICC against the Russian President Vladimir Putin on the case of the deportation. Right. We know that we broke the story about the deportation. And the people who we discovered are kind of the face of the story of the deportation. In autumn 2022, we found, we published the first bigger article about the deportation of 3 Ukrainian children and attempt to adopt them in Russia. Became quite a famous story. So that particular story of the family of Mezhevi, which is written also at the Vanity Fair, they are like a showcase for that ICC investigation. We would be concerned that people who were interviewed too many times by the media might be dropped as witnesses by the ICC. But, breaking this case as a case, bringing attention to the issue of the deportation of the children. So partially we can say we did participated in shaping that arrest warrant. It's definitely we feel that there is a credit of our work in this particular investigation. And the TRP organization run by Giannini Di Giovanni has a separate project on interviewing the parents and the guardians about researching the indoctrination which is happening in the occupied territories. So there is a specific role of the TRP organization in documenting this story of the deportation of the children. Well, in Ukraine and everywhere, they today say that unless there is a media attention, unless people care, there are less chances to open the case. So, it's kind of a duality.
So there is a duality between those that are maybe more public-faced survivors, but perhaps the actual case will be brought on
somebody else. Yeah,
somebody else that the general public has never read about.
What also is done, a year ago, it was the initiative of the Reckoning Project lawyers. We initiated the criminal complaint to the Federal Court of Argentina using the universal jurisdiction, traveling with a Ukrainian man who survived tortures and electrocution in occupied part of Ukraine. The case is still there. It's up to the Argentinian judge to consider whether they would open the case. What was for us absolutely important to show also it's a story of one man, and we cannot justify tortures even of one man. And it's not about the politics. It's not about global south. It's not about east or west. People shouldn't be tortured because Argentina has this tradition of investigating the crimes connected to the illegal detentions and tortures, including electrocution, because of the dirty wars of 80s. So that's why it was Argentina. And again, and another justification was indeed that we want to show that it's not about the West, it's not about Europe, that this case is universal.
And this was through the Reckoning Project? It was your Reckoning Project lawyers who came up with this strategy?
Yeah, there were a couple of us. There were me, our survivor, and our Argentinian lawyers. The whole idea of the universal jurisdiction, that such crimes as the crimes against humanity and the war crimes, they are so gross that some of the countries have the legislation that they would prosecute those crimes disregarding where they have happened.
Now, are all of these survivors civilians, or do you also interview POWs about their time and potential torture during their time as POWs?
In our case, we work mainly with civilians. We had these discussions talking to the Ukrainian prisoners of war. Absolute majority of them were brutally tortured. I do think that it's also very important to investigate the crimes against prisoners of war. The tragic part of that story is that there is always this kind of concern that if you speak too much about that, they would stop releasing them.
Ah, okay. No, there was just a large swap recently. That makes sense.
It was a very special swap. What makes this swap very special is that Russia actually didn't give much of the prisoners of war. What they did, they returned a lot of inmates, the people who were in usual prisons for criminal offense in the occupied territories. They can just, grab 1,000 of the Ukrainians under their command and give them. Of course, we're happy to have them. What you really think about very well thought prisoners exchange, when you really need to save the life of the journalist Anne or some kind of Ukrainian military or some political activists. That's what they are doing, using the people as the bargaining chip and just like taking these poor inmates charged for the criminal offense somewhere in the occupation. And then you're like, who are these people? They return. Okay, that lets them free, but it's a bit different thing.
Well, in fact, hostages are a renewable resource. As long as they occupy the territory, they can take more hostages all too easily. So, but of course, with the POWs, obviously the military don't want to jeopardize. I'm talking about real POW for POW exchanges.
That's true, but that's the whole point. If you're a former prisoner, a military, you have the right to tell what you want. And there is no Ukrainian state to tell the person not to do that.
If they're former military, if they're still in uniform, if they remain in uniform.
It's Ukraine. Like in Ukraine, people don't care. They will still speak. The problem that it is, the Russians then are very, very negative. They're saying, we're giving you these people, but they stop speaking. But they start speaking. The Ukrainian state cannot forbid people to speak. It's actually the clash of the mindset, which is also very paradoxically tragic during this war.
That is probably the greatest difference between Russia and Ukraine. It's not the language or the accent if someone does speak Russian with a Ukrainian accent. It's actually the mindset.
Absolutely. What I also understood that this clash creates kind of a very violent situation in which you imagine you're a Ukrainian, you're probably 25 or 30, lady or gentleman, worked in a farm, born, let's say, end of the Soviet Union, early independence. You have no idea why you should become the part of Russia. You speak the language you speak, it's your town. What is also strange that the Russians also couldn't understand that it's not President Zelensky given the order from the farmer in some kind of village to behave as he behaves, to be loyal to Ukrainian land, to have own opinion about what religions he wants, he has, what views he has. There is no such a line in Ukraine. It's an individual. And they are trying to kind of break their spirit, say like, tell us, give us a secret. Who has ordered you to do this? And, nobody. So for them, it's also what we understood from these interviews of the survivors is that they also don't understand what these Russians want from them. Because
do they talk about the Russification, the changes in the education?
Of course.
Yeah.
That's also very tragic with this occupation that in Crimea and in the Eastern Ukraine, and I wrote quite a big piece for the Foreign Affairs about those experience of the occupation of the last 12 years. It's like as if the toolkit has been developed on how to occupy fast. It took them some years to understand how you change the healthcare system, how you provide passports, how you create an education in which Ukraine doesn't exist, in which, there is this great Russian empire. But what happened that in the newly occupied territories after 2022, they have already the tool. They already know how to indoctrinate kids. They already know how to create the legislation. So, for instance, now you would have the situation in which, if you don't take the Russian passport, for instance, you probably won't be able to call an ambulance and things like that. That's why for Ukrainians, what we should also say very much, occupation is way more scarier than the war. The life under the, what we call the war, it's one thing. I think we need a bit to be very clear with the vocabulary. What we have in Ukraine, it's foreign invasion. And of course, President Trump may say, stop the war. But if you understand that it's invasion, occupation is not peace. Occupation is a war. Occupation is a part of the war. So what Ukrainians are now forced to agree is a part of the country stop to defend itself from the invasion and agree for the occupation. In both cases, it's don't stop the war. It do not stop suffering. Of course, you can successfully defend yourself. This is our experience of the 3 years. If you fight back, if you have the army, if you have, like it happened, Ukrainian army freed Kiev region, Kharkiv region, Kherson region, and you can live there, you can breathe there, you can go to school. The bomb can still fall, but the chances of you surviving is there if the Ukrainian army defend the city. If you live under the occupation, there are very little chances what will happen to you. You can be detained, you can be in prison. So in a way, I think at this moment when there is this kind of talks everywhere about negotiations, I do think it's very important to use this vocabulary of how we see these people, how we see the solutions. Is occupation the peace? Can you just stop, defend itself from the invasion, and that would end the war?
That's interesting. I should also make it clear to listeners, you're obviously independent of the United Nations and its agencies and bodies. You're also independent of the Ukrainian government, military, the Zelensky administration. Is that right?
Sure.
Yeah. Your most recent article for The Atlantic was on drones, and you did go embed and meet with drone operators. Not certain how close you were to the front line there. Were they at all reflective? I mean, are they aware that they are really in the process of inventing a new way of war fighting?
Yes, at this stage, Ukrainian military are aware that they're inventing something totally new, because even I've been embedded with 3 various brigades in the different parts of the front line. The one very kind of high tech, the one which was kind of a legendary, traditional mechanic infantry brigade, and quite a smaller one, which was created after 2022 from the people from the territorial defense. Very different. And almost everybody to whom I talked kind of reconfirmed that the way they fight the war is very different from how they used to do a year ago.
A year ago, it has changed that much, the drone technology and tactics.
Absolutely, because before the drones were additional, supplementary to something. They help to target, they help to do that. But now the drones are mainly used instead of the artillery. So the whole artillery is mainly, the whole...
I mean, is that a capacity issue? They don't have enough artillery?
There was enough artillery, so it became more precise and different. And what also for me was it's probably very important also for your audience to tell, because, the drone warfare was not new. There is an Obama doctrine. There was drones in Pakistan. It's totally not new. But what for me was important also to say that I read myself years ago this article when there was a guy in Nevada targeting somebody in Afghanistan.
Right, I read that. Everybody's read that, but everyone who's interested in drones has
everybody read that article. Which is very different. Mm-hmm. It's a very frontline experience. You're a few kilometers. You are in a dangerous position, just in the front line.
So there's not that philosophical issue of the disconnected being
there
out of
is
harm's
no disconnect.
way. You are in harm's way.
You're in a dangerous position. You can be killed at any given moment, and you operating, from the field, from the foxhole, from the dugout.
Has the Ukrainian military started evolving their doctrine for drone technology, or are they making it up on the fly?
There is, but the doctrine is more or less the same. The doctrine is what is very tricky about this warfare. The NATO doctrine, the usual doctrine, what I understand as a journalist, is that you need to control the sky. So you cannot just have this very gruesome infantry war. I think that's how Donald Trump sees it. When the infantry is fighting infantry, it's very devastating. And that's what Ukrainians really trying to say. So far, we had to fight. We had to fight a lot, this kind of old-fashioned infantry war, which none of the NATO countries would ever do, because you risk the life of your own people. What you need to do is to control the sky and do not allow the enemy come so close to your front, to your line, so you don't need to risk the life of your infantry. You cut them out further. And the deep strike further into the Russian command and control center can stop that. That's why Ukraine argued so long that allow us to use the strikes in depth so Russian command and control centers would be destroyed. In the end, it's destroy less of the Russian soldiers, to be honest, less of the human rights from the Russians, but it destroys less of the lives of the Ukrainians. You just don't let them go. In fact, you can do this.
And Ukraine has the manpower issue. Obviously, it's a smaller country, so you need to, besides for the humanistic reasons you want to preserve your lives, for practical reasons you need to preserve them.
Yes, because it's not about the resources. It's about capabilities. And these are different things. Resource-wise, Ukraine is smaller than Russia. It has lesser resources. In terms of capabilities are not always equal. You can have better capabilities. You can be efficient with in the way how you work with your resources. So in this regard, what drones help It's to deny Russian superiority on air, at least to some extent, something which we were not getting from quite a lot of our Western allies. So Ukraine needed to develop its own capability, at least, yes.
To control the sky, or at least have parity. I mean, I control the sky, I don't know if that's feasible to join.
So meaning like, yes, you probably cannot like control the skies over the Russian controlled territory, but you deny them the opportunity to control the skies above you. So you have this exactly kind of parity, which in the end saved the lives of your own soldiers. So yes, kind of doctrine changed. I do believe that what I understand from the talking to the military analysts, the doctrine is changed, but by the different tool. And I do think I think what is also fascinating with the spider web operation, which also kind of shows very well that Russia is not invincible. But again, technology is not expensive. In fact, what was fascinating in this operation is not that Ukraine invented some kind of incredible drones. The ballistic missiles to target Russia that far in Siberia cost millions. And these drones are cheap, but you needed to have a planning, a system, operation.
18 months, reportedly.
Yes, it's about message, but the destruction of the particular bombers and the fighter jets, especially, clearly knowing that the Russian resources are also not infinite. They have a particular number of these jets. Those jets were produced during the Soviet times, meaning they won't produce them very fast. Where we made a huge mistake. I think that the Ukrainians also, for some time, not like underestimated the Russian army, because also I should say, like, they're fighting, they are redeveloping itself, they're learning about the drones. I also don't, like, they're learning, they have the scale, they're developing, they bought the technology from Iran to develop the Shahid drones, which are, terrorizing Ukrainian cities. They do have the North Korean troops. They have the supply of the artillery shells from North Korea. They're using North Korean ballistic missiles. So there is a lot how also the Russian army is evolving. They are capable to spend, a huge budget. But what we didn't expect from, I think, like in early 2022, when the full invasion happened, kind of from the films and from the stereotypes, you thought like, oh, there is a Russian army, the Ukrainian army, probably the Russian army is a bit more organized, but they're drinking more, like something like that on the human level. But you know what we missed? That during the war in Chechnya, during the war in Syria, this army was using the war crimes as a way to wage the war. It's a very brutal army which uses this kind of chaos and impunity, which has a system of tortures, which has a system, like with the Reckoning Project, with our lawyers, with what we do, we also understand the patterns. The people tortured by the Russian soldiers in the north, in the south, in the east, in 2022, in 23, 2024, and today, are tortured in a similar way. The towns are destroyed and erased and wiped out, in the very similar way. The Russians would target the hospital. Hospital is protected because they know that then the people would leave the town because they are not capable to occupy the towns in the, let's say, usual way. What they can do is spend months to obliterate Bakhmut, so there is no city. And then the Ukrainian, what is the Russian strategy of waging this war? And they are moving very slow. They're not really capable to occupy a big town. What they can do is to destroy it to extent that there is no point for the Ukrainian army to hold into the piece of land, where you can't even hide.
Well, Mariupol would be the other classic
Mariupol
example.
is a bit different in this regard because at early stage of the war, it was very abrupt. They were able to occupy Mariupol within the first months of the war. But if we would remember, since summer 2022, they were not capable to occupy any bigger town, keeping it intact. What they were able later to fight for 5 months for Bakhmut, destroy Bakhmut, fight for 5 months, Avdiivka, destroyed. So they literally are capable to occupy destroyed land and claim it.
It's the land that they want, not the city.
Sometimes they claim the victory, and then you understand that it was a village of like 3 people. Or they want to kind of create this image they are winning. So, but that's what I'm saying. That
So you think it's partly a PR war for the Oval Office and maybe other potential.
The Russians try to persuade the world that they are winning this war. But I find this idea that just because they're big, they're invincible, quite a primitive one.
But there's the sledgehammer approach, and that we saw really from Prigozhin.
Yeah. So, of course, for Ukraine, it's harder to fight its war because we value our soldiers, And let me be critical. I won't say every commander. I probably think that there would be some commander who cares less and who is, risking too much. So it's not like, every single Ukrainian commander is kind of cherishing the life of every single, I don't want to romanticize it. There are problems. The Ukrainian army is a huge, operation of a lot of people who are newly trained, who came to service just after 2022. What is fascinating with the Ukrainian army? Ukraine has 70,000 soldiers.
Okay, so 70,000.
Before 2014. Then, before 2022, we developed an army of 300,000. Now it's almost 2 million. Who are these people? Usual people, normal people, my friends, my colleagues, your barista, your janitor, your professor, CEO, wherever, all kind of usual people. They need to train. It's an army of civilians, which have to force to live in a very different mindset of like obeying, having the military rules. So it's a
Does every family have...
Almost every Ukrainian family has somebody who is serving, almost, and definitely a colleague, a friend, or wherever. But it's like a usual people. So again, it's quite an army. Somebody is less trained, somebody is too old, somebody is not physically capable. Sometimes you really do stupid things. Sometimes maybe some brigades are stronger, some are lesser, some do, not very efficient way of rationing the equipment. So I won't romanticize Ukrainian army. But still, what is the main task for the Ukrainian soldier? What is the Ukrainian soldier is told, for instance, in case of becoming a prisoner of war? Save your life. Tell any crap. Tell you have a loyalty to Putin, wherever. Save your life. What the Russian soldiers said, don't give up, they will shoot the traitor. They will shoot and destroy their own people. That is a difference. But also the idea of the cannon fodder, just the throwing people. What term is existing in Russian? It's called, I even ever saw it. It's so common. It's like in our language, it's like the usual phrase. It's called like the reconnaissance during the fight, which means you throw the people, like 5 people, for clearly they would be shelled for one reason, that then the Ukrainians would you can identify from where Ukrainians are shelling. So you're literally using them as a human trap.
Right, you're counting the guns with their bodies.
You're counting their guns with their bodies. And it's like, that's the most common things. And they are doing it constantly. So it's really a very inhumane, but also the odd part of it that now in the Russian army, they have the huge incentives to people fight. So it's really like kind of a bit of mercenary army because a lot of people in Russia have mortgages that their way. It's not like they're forced to go. They make this choice because then probably they would pay the mortgage. It would bring some money. And I find it also a bit like an immoral immorally kind of strange idea when out of your citizens, you're creating this kind of army of mercenaries from your own citizens saying like, okay, earning money for a mortgage, but go to the foreign country and kill people. In any ways, it's like, but they're using this practice, which is really inhumane, which is hard to fight. But the answer is very clear. That's why, since they are ready to risk the life of their soldiers, probably you better, not let them be close because you won't fight the very same way.
So that's where the drones come in and why the Ukraine army has become so creative with the use of drones.
Yep. You find your other way. Yeah. It took me some time also to rethink the whole idea of the war as somebody who comes from the human rights. Because in the end, you clearly understand the experience of the Crimea occupation, the experience of the Donbass occupation, say that there is no way you pacify somebody who is pointing gun at you and still telling, I want to kill you. There is a level to how much you can tell a person with a gun, don't kill me. You can beg, but it doesn't help. And sometimes as a human, even like if you're a humanist, even if you're a person who believes in reconciliation, in the negotiations, I was brought up, I was trained in the idea of the peace negotiations, reconciliations, that there is always diplomatic way. But no, we understand that sometimes against some of the malign forces, the only way is kind of your deterrence, the only way you don't need to kill. So for instance, why I find the Operation Spiderweb successful, civilians were not involved. Ukraine did something which you can speak about. This operation didn't harm Russian civilians. Everybody saw that, like everybody kind of saw that the target was very clearly military target. And the Russians would what? Retaliate with bombing a hospital, double strike against rescue workers. So I do think that there is a level, and still, I'm not in favor of the war, but I think there is a way to stop the invasion. And unless Ukraine fight the war by the rules, trying to target Russian soldiers, trying to preserve civilians, like not wasting human lives. But yes, you really understand that there is a just war. That's why the UN exists. That's why there are all these Geneva Conventions. There are these rules. For a normal human being to accept that like there are rules of the war, it's like, oh, it's war. No, there are rules of the war. And I think that important for me, Ukraine is trying to play by the rules of this war, at least to some extent, which is possible. And Russia don't. If you really talk to military, to American military, they always would say that, from the military point of view, the way the Russia fights this war, it's not just immoral, but it doesn't make sense. They really cause a lot of damage to civilians. It's like a bit like the terrorist kind of state.
Now, defending your country from invasion, okay, already that's quite a lot. Is there a desire in Ukraine, though, to go beyond that and to make changes in Russia? We met a fighter. We interviewed a fighter earlier on our podcast. He's Canadian, but he's fighting with the Kalinovsky Regiment of Belarusian volunteers. Mm-hmm. And he did say that many of them do dream of going back and changing their country after this conflict. Is there a sense that Russia needs to change for the situation to improve? Or is it just like, look, we just want them to go away. They can do whatever they want in their corner of the world as long as they leave us alone?
I think the latter. Because, of course, the democratic Russia would be at least our guarantee for more security. If Russia is not democratic, there is always the risk it remains like it is. Yet, I think that for Ukraine, it's not about like stopping Russia globally. We are not capable, but for us, it's very clear. They shouldn't have the capability to fight in that way, with that weapon against. Oh, I think it's my turn on, air alert. It's still working. Hey,
oh my gosh, we are hearing an air alert from Kyiv.
Yes, I think because on my one phone I switch it off.
Even though you're traveling? Oh my gosh.
Yes. It's always
that makes it real.
Yeah, it is. There is air alert because also it's already night in Ukraine. It's usually
right. So this is when it happens. But there's one more question that you did just remind me of, which is that I know that many Ukrainians were critical, while he was alive, of Navalny and even now of some of the attention that Yulia Navalnaya gets. But it sounds like what you're saying is maybe the sentiment is not necessarily opposed to the pro-democracy in Russia. And obviously your husband is Russian and a journalist, I should say, and a journalist in exile. Yeah, obviously, yes. But it's not necessarily that they're opposed to that, but just stay in your own lane. That's a separate problem, but the Ukrainians are only concerned now about preserving Ukraine.
Yes, Ukrainians are concerned about preserving Ukraine. I think that there is still kind of some maybe disappointment. I would use this term in terms of some of the, let's say, liberal Russians, mainly because, first of all, I feel very bad for Alexei Navalny being killed. It was a hard day for me. I knew people whose friend he was. Yet I do think that the Russian society outside of Russia is very automized. And when I speak to a lot of Russian colleagues and some of the friends, so many of them, they are just like lost and they can't do much. And what they usually feel, it's like, we feel so pity. And we always say, it's not about us, you feel pity about us. Do something. So this is the idea. Can you do something? It's a bit too long for, it's a very hard interaction. It's for the third year. Meet your colleagues and friends, and they start the discussion. We can do nothing. And I'm thinking, are you in a better condition than and worse condition? I understand it's difficult. You're in exile in New York, in Berlin. I live in Kiev. So for me to listen for an hour how difficult is their life in Berlin, in New York, and that they can do nothing, I will think like, I could always also say I could do nothing, but we're doing something. Like, I think that there is also this difference that people are like as if they are withdrawn from their responsibility of serving kind of a bigger cause. People trying to preserve their families, jobs, trying to find their way outside as if it has nothing to do with them. So I think that also for some of the activists, which was the kind of the criticism that some of the Russian activists, they're still speaking about corruption inside Russia, but not like the war. But I think like speaking about the corruption is quite too outdated. There is something else you can do. There is a bigger cause.
Well, that was, of course, Navalny's cause and what eventually led to his end. But it's interesting what you're saying is it's not that you don't support their anti-corruption cause in Russia, but you feel that they should pay more attention to what Russia is doing in Ukraine and perhaps elsewhere in their foreign policy.
And I do very much differentiate. And that's what I'm trying. I know I'm very open because, having a Russian husband and, trying to say that, I don't speak the Russian, it would be strange.
And I guess, through your husband, I should say that he's with Mediazona. I don't know if you've also met Pussy Riot and then
Yeah.
So a lot of high-profile Russian dissidents.
I know quite a lot of high-profile Russian dissidents, and I see my person. So sometimes I need to defend them in front of the Ukrainians, saying but I would always say I see the difference between the people who just feel pity and the people who think that they need to do something to help Ukraine to win this war. That is a big difference, by the way. I think that if people want to help Ukraine to win this war, of course they should. If the only thing is looking at me as the powerless victim and they can do nothing about that, okay, it's maybe better than they support Putin. But I cannot totally relate to that as a human being. But again, it's more disappointing. I feel sad about the Russian society that I don't see it as a society. I see a few individuals who try to do something. I talked to one of the colleagues who once tried to say that his attempt was at least to kind of gather Russian liberals to create something like the list, which would issue an open letter, just a very simple thing that would be public people who would kind of condemn the Russian strikes against Ukraine on a regular basis. And they didn't make this open letter. And I thought wow, if it's that difficult, okay, what can I expect? But I think it's up to them. I know it's difficult. I'm saying I'm very grateful to the Ukrainian armed forces that I'm capable as a professional be appreciated not because of pity, but because of what I'm doing, because I still am able to be inside the country, speak to my audience, do my job. You would also interview me if I would be a Ukrainian exile reporter and sit in this room and I would tell you how difficult is the life in occupied Ukraine, because when people speaking about the end of this war, they kind of understand that what is offered to Ukraine is to give up and to be in exile. So I'm really glad that we are seen not kind of out of pity, but as somebody who is doing something in a very difficult conditions without claiming that the war in Ukraine is more important than any other war. I would make the argument that the war against Ukraine is important because it's about sovereignty. So there is a capable society inside of Ukraine. There is kind of democracy in Ukraine. There is a political will to support Ukraine. There is a legitimate framework to support Ukraine, to defend it, to help Ukraine to defend its population. There is political will to wage and to undergo investigation, to search for accountability. So if we are not able to do anything, to do much in case of Ukraine, can we do anything else at all? And I do think that we can do it in Ukraine, so we can make it in more difficult terrains. But then you can say if you can't deal with Ukraine in the UN, how you can sort out all these complicated other issues? I'm saying that there is nothing extraordinary about Ukrainians. We are forced to do extraordinary things, which I respect a lot in my compatriots.
So it's ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances.
We just happen to be in this survival mode and forces people to show their worst and their best. Somehow, I saw the best.
Natalia, thank you so much for joining us in the Delegates Lounge.
Thank you for having me.
And that's it from the Delegates Lounge. We'd like to thank our esteemed guests who've graciously allowed us to share their hard-earned insights into what really matters. And then there's you, our listeners, who we hope are sufficiently edified to clamour for more of the same. Do drop in for a weekly episode on Thursday or from time to time if we're on the road for special events, in which case there'll be a bonus episode. Subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you like what you've heard, please take a moment to rate or review the show, as it helps others who share your abiding interest in world affairs to find their way to the Delegates Lounge. You can connect with us on many popular social media platforms or reach out to us directly at info@thedelegateslounge.com. We're a small team, so we can't respond to every message, but we will read them. Our show this week was written and produced by the host and by yours truly, executive producer Frank Radford. Until next time, keep calm and curious.